You've written this book, which is sort of, it's part novel, part biography of your grandparents, Anna und Gunther, and it's a loving tribute to them. But there's an enormous your grandmother Anna was raised in sort of Czechoslovakia.
That's right.
And your grandfather German. So you look at, and they were born, just before the Second World War and survived the war. Your grandfather was a soldier, and then subsequently met. There's a lot of research there, isn't there?
There is. I think, when I started writing the book, learning more about sort of World War II history and European history was a bit of a personal passion of mine. And in doing so, at the same time that I was doing that, I was able to really uncover a lot of these stories from my grandparents that really intertwined with that. So a big part of the project was trying to get these stories, out of my grandmother, and then, on a separate timeline, kind of trying to understand, where does this fit into things like the invasion of Poland, the Cold War afterwards, and how all that works. Because I think it was, the way that she told the stories to me, because you mentioned she was very young at the time, it was a very different perspective of the war from a very sort of young, personal, innocent girl. And of course from a German girl, which I think is, German civilians sort of caught up in all of that.
Now you had their stories. Did you have your grandfather's stories as well? When did he die?
So my grandfather unfortunately died about 8 years ago now.
Yeah.
So I wasn't able to get the stories from him firsthand. So all the stories from Gunther, from my grandfather, came through Anna, and they'd been married for over 50 years. So a lot she'd been able to kind of remember that he'd passed on to her. And, for that reason, it probably was a bit harder to research his part of the book. If you...
Did he ever talk about the war?
He did a little bit, but I think not too much. I think a lot of the stories in there are, some of them are quite traumatic. And I think, growing up, both him and her had been quite closed off at times about that. And that was, one of the... really hard things about writing the book was how to get, her to open up and encourage her to share those stories.
You also had to then project,
yes,
because it's not just, there's a lot of context, there's a lot of imagination that you had to apply to the story. You had to fill it out.
That's right.
Which I think you did very well because, sometimes you've invented her voice and it sounds like her still. Which I think is the skill, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. I think it's easy to, writing a sort of World War II era book to kind of get lost in the history and that aspect that can become a bit dry.
You went there, didn't you, and came back, and that sparked it, really.
That's right. That's exactly it. I went and, 4 years ago now, I went and visited the small town in the Sudetes Mountains, just over the border in Czechoslovakia where she grew up.
And that sparked memories for her.
That was it. Yeah, I took some photos while I was there. There were only a few buildings that were still left standing, but there was one picture of a chapel. And as soon as she saw that chapel in the middle of the town, she began telling me all these stories of, when she was 5 to 8 years old in the town in extremely vivid memory. She was 88 years old at this point.
Yes, there's a lot of understanding about the war. This fascinated me here. The Nazi Party passed an action known as the State Hereditary Farm Law. I can't pronounce that. How's your German?
I couldn't pronounce it without reading it in front of me. Sounds right to me.
Incredible word. And the farm life, because she was raised on this farm.
Yes,
and she became a nurse after the war, didn't she?
That's right. She always dreamt of becoming a nurse, but her mother sort of had to take over the farm when her father was sent away to war.
That's right. And he returns, which is an extraordinary moment. I think you capture that very well, Jacob Hendryx, that when, he's back, because, that it must be, if you have a loved one away at that war, and such a comprehensive war all around you, he'd never, or she'd never be out of your mind. And then there they are, back, and it's a marvellous scene. I mustn't give too much away. But your grandfather fought for the Germans, and there's also a scene where he loses his best friend.
That's right.
Who virtually dies in his arms. Terrible.
Yeah, and I mean, especially, the age at which he was sort of recruited into the Germans. It was, towards the end of the war. So he was 15 when he was sort of conscripted into the army.
Then he's taken prisoner.
That's right.
Prisoner of war of the Americans, and then escapes.
That's right.
And works in a glass factory for a couple of years.
Yeah, well,
because he's wanted.
That's it. He couldn't exactly go back to Germany. So he was in France when he was in the prison camp, and when he escaped, he managed to sort of flee across the border to Belgium on foot. But obviously, it was sort of too risky to go back to Germany. So he sort of hid out there for a little while
Until it wasn't, and he could
That's
return
right.
to his own country. Then, unusually. Well, I mean, a lot of Germans came after the Second World War. He comes to work. He doesn't like the cold.
That's right.
And there's no orphan there.
Yeah.
But he comes to Tasmania, where it's cold.
He has this idea in his head of Australia just being full of outback, like I'm sure a lot of probably Europeans and Americans did at the time, and he was rudely shocked.
And then he goes somewhere else and it's cold too, and then thinks, no, I'm going back home.
That's
after
right.
2 years, when he meets your grandmother in the beer hall.
Yes.
And it's kind of love at first sight, isn't it?
It is. They clicked like that. I think it was, only a few months later, and they were in love and taking off across the other side of the world together.
And they arrived like our wonderful governor, Hugh Van Lay, said, with, very little and the suitcase of dreams.
Yes.
And they in Perth originally, they don't like Perth very much.
Yeah, well, I mean, they had a lot of trouble finding work in Perth, and I think that was the first stop for all of the European migrants. So you can imagine the employment market was a little bit flooded at the time.
And kangaroos, they want to see kangaroos.
Yeah, of course.
And they do. They come eventually to Adelaide, where there are more Germans, they feel.
And that's right. They spend some time in Port Augusta on the way there, and then eventually they settle and they find a home in Adelaide.
It was sad that, and this is so typical of the immigrant experience, that your qualifications in your home country often mean nothing in the adopted country. And similarly, your grandmother was a nurse in Germany.
That's right.
And then comes here to find that she has no qualifications.
Yeah.
And then works as an attendant, both in Port Augusta. There's a funny story about her working hours in Port Augusta. You tell that, Jacob.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such a, in Australia, I think it's common for us to say, 6 to 10 or 10 to 6, 10 minutes to 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, your first day at the hospital is tomorrow and you'll be working 10 to 6. So she hears that and she says, oh, okay, 10 to 6. I'll be there at 10 minutes before 6. And she gets up in the middle of the night, rides her little bike through dark Port Augusta to the other side of the town. And she gets there and the head attendant says, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And she says, you told me to be here at 10 to 6. And she says, no, I want you start at 10 o'clock and you finish at 6 p.m. You could go home and come back in 4 hours. And she laughs at that story. She still tells it today.
There's a kindness too that these grandparents had virtually nothing in Port Augusta, and they're scratching out life, and then they pass a bike shop, and a very kind man, gives them a bike and and asks them to pay it off, which they do assiduously.
That's right.
And it was lovely, the kindness, which is in contrast to them being called Nazis in shops.
I think there was quite a contrast in sort of, both the sort of country town warm welcome and the tension I think they felt, because of course they arrived in Port Augusta, late 1950s, so the wounds of the war hadn't healed, and being a small town, they're probably, not used to so many Germans, so they stuck out like a bit of a sore thumb. But
that, I mean, that's still the case in communities.
It is.
The outside. I mean, your father might have felt that, even though he was a teacher, thus valued, and an American, thus not our enemy once. But he would have felt an outsider for a while.
I would agree. I think in Port Augusta as well, probably the role at the hospital really went a long way into helping her integrate into the community, because suddenly she's in a point where she's caring for the health of the local Australians.
And and your grandmother worked at which hospital here?
The Royal Adelaide.
The Royal Adelaide.
She worked at the Royal Adelaide
as an attendant for 20 years.
Yes, that's right.
Until they allowed her to retrain as a nurse.
That's right. It was 20 years here before they passed a new rule saying that they would recognise the European qualifications, and she just sort of had to, resit the entrance exam. And she'd famously, been advising even some of the younger nurses on what to do based on all the experience she'd had in Germany for years. So she, blitzed that without a problem, of course.
And like so many, here we are. This is where, they were called Nazis. And someone advises them, I think it was Gunther telling, you just need to love them as if they loved you back. Sooner or later they'll realise we're all the same.
That's it. That's it. And then that's exactly what happened.
It was sad in the book, Jacob Hendryx, my guest, author of Anna und Gunther, they need a loan, and they can only get so much, and they have to get a second mortgage at rather extortionate rates.
That's right.
For the second bit to build the house. I thought that was sad.
It was. And, I think without any, borrowing history or anything in Australia before that, it was quite hard for them even just to get the first loan.
What does she think of it, your grandmother?
Look, I think she's extremely proud, and we wrote it very closely together over sort of 3 or 4 years. The book took, and the way I sort of wrote it was chapter by chapter at a time, and she would read each chapter and kind of give me a bit of feedback as well if something wasn't quite right, so we could get it as accurate as possible.
I think it's a marvellous thing that you've done. It's a beautiful book. It's a very heartfelt book, and it's extremely well written. I congratulate you and whoever edited it, because I couldn't find a single error.
That's good.
I'm always so pedantic about that, but it reads so fluidly and so beautifully. Anna and Gunther by Jacob Hendryx. I think too, you might do something on your parents now.
On my parents? Well, I think hopefully they've got a little bit of a story left to tell, but
True.
It's definitely in the back of my mind, what the next project's going to be, once this is all out and we've sort of done all the publicity for this.
As a person who's lost parents and grandparents naturally, I really, what you regret is what you didn't ask them. The gaps in knowledge. And, that you think, why didn't I ask them? We're too busy, we're often kind of embarrassed by parents and grandparents and not interested in them. We love them, but, we're moving on. And we don't stop and ask them the questions that you've done. And it's the most marvellous living tribute to your grandparents that you've achieved here.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really important, and a few of the, reviews have kind of picked up on that. There was a line that I just opened to that I wrote sort of at the end of the author's note, which I think is quite important. And it says, one of thousands of stories that grandparents around the world might still be holding on to today, keeping to themselves until somebody is ready to listen.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's important to listen. Yeah. But what was the impulse to write? Was it this story?
It was this story. And I didn't start out, to write a story. Like I said, I sort of... my grandmother opened up to me about these stories in the town when I showed her the photos. And originally, because I was interested in the historical side of it, I sort of wanted to plot it on a timeline. And, one timeline of the stories that she'd told me and a parallel timeline of what was going on in the world. And it got too complex. So I took the stories from growing up in that small town and turned it into just a short story.
Yep.
And that was sort of what went on to form chapter 1.
Yep.
Now, I gave her that short story as a gift, and as soon as she read it, she was thrilled to be able to sort of see her own stories be told back to her. And after she'd read it, I could sort of say, well, okay, tell me what happened next. Tell me more about it. And, she continued to open up to me sort of time and time again. And the whole, book was written in that style, sort of chapter by chapter at a time, sometimes not exactly knowing where it was going to lead either.
All the way through, I kept thinking, I'd like to meet her. And then I thought, well, I have.
You have.
I've met this lady through this book. Good on you, Jacob. Always good to see you, and I wish you and your family well. And thank you very much for this book, Anna und Gunther, Jacob Hendryx, and it's available, all over the place.
That's right.
Online where?
Online at Booktopia and Amazon.
Yes.
If you favour the ebook, it's on the Kindle store as well.
Yes.
And it's also available from all good bookstores. And if they don't have it in, I'm sure they'll order it for you.
Thank you, Jacob. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Peter.
Jacob Hendryx there here on ABC Radio.